The blood on his hands was still wet when he heard her voice for the first time. A cascade of sounds that moved like water over river stones. Nothing like the English he had spoken all his 24 years. Russell Sawyer looked up from where he knelt beside the overturned wagon. His fingers pressed against the dying man's throat, searching for a pulse that had already faded. The woman stood 10 feet away, her dark eyes wide with horror, speaking rapidly in a language that sounded like music even in this moment of death. She wore a simple cotton dress, dusty from travel, and her black hair hung in a long braid down her back. Behind her, the New Mexico sun blazed white and merciless across the desert landscape, making her seem almost like an apparition. It was July 1878, and Russell had seen plenty of death in his years working cattle drives and guarding freight wagons, but he had never seen anyone quite like her. He stood slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm, though he realized too late that his palms were covered in the dead man's blood. She took a step back, still talking in that strange, flowing language, her voice rising with what he recognized as questions. Her hands moved as she spoke, gesturing toward the body, toward him, toward the 2 dead horses tangled in their traces. The wagon had clearly been ambushed, shot full of holes, the driver killed before the horses had run it off the trail and into a shallow ravine. "I did not do this," Russell said carefully, speaking slowly as if that might somehow help her understand. "I found him like this, found you like this." She stopped talking and stared at him, her chest rising and falling quickly. Then she spoke again, a single sentence that sounded like a question, her tone desperate and afraid. When he could only shake his head helplessly, she tried again in what might have been Spanish, but her accent was so thick he could barely make out the words. "Something about help, something about danger, danger," he repeated, seizing on the one word he recognized. "Yes, whoever did this might come back." He pointed to his horse, grazing 30 yards away. "We need to go, come with me." She followed his gesture and seemed to understand that much at least. When he started walking toward his mount, she followed at a distance, still watching him with wary eyes. Russell was used to being alone, preferred it most of the time, but as he swung up into the saddle and reached down to help her up behind him, he felt something shift in his chest. She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, and when she settled behind him on the horse, her arms wrapping around his waist for balance, he was acutely aware of every point where her body touched his. They rode toward Pino's Altos in silence except for the sound of hoofbeats and the creak of leather. Russell had been headed there anyway, planning to meet a freight company that needed guards for a shipment to Santa Fe, but now his mind raced with questions he could not ask. Who was she? Where had she come from? What language did she speak? It was not Spanish, though there had been something Spanish in her desperate attempts to communicate. Not Apache or Navajo either, from what little he knew of those tongues. Something else entirely. Something foreign in a way that suggested she had come from very far away indeed. Pino's Altos was a small mining town nestled in the hills, its main street dusty and lined with rough wooden buildings. Russell rode straight to the sheriff's office, but the man was gone, out investigating some claim dispute. The deputy, a young fool named Peters, barely looked up from his card game when Russell tried to explain about the dead man and the ambushed wagon. "Probably bandits," Peters said with a shrug. "Happens all the time on that road. Did you bring back the body?" "I brought back a witness," Russell said, frustrated. "A woman who might have seen who did it if anyone bothers to ask her proper." Peters finally looked at the woman standing beside Russell, and his eyes crawled over her in a way that made Russell's jaw tighten. "She a Mexican?" "I do not think so. She speaks something else." "Well, I cannot help you if she cannot talk American. Sheriff will be back tomorrow, maybe the day after. You can try again then. Russell left the office with his hands clenched, the woman following close behind him. He could feel eyes on them as they walked down the street, the kind of attention any stranger drew in a small town, but especially a woman alone with a cowboy covered in someone else's blood. He needed to clean up, needed to figure out what to do with her, needed to make sense of the whole situation. The boarding house where he sometimes rented a room had no vacancies, but the owner, a Mexican woman named Senora Ortiz, took one look at the girl and started speaking rapid Spanish. The woman responded, still with that heavy accent, but this time Russell caught more words. Lost. Alone. Afraid. The wagon driver had been taking her somewhere, though where exactly remained unclear through the language barrier. Senora Ortiz turned to Russell with a severe expression. This girl needs help. She is from very far away, she says. From across the ocean. Her English is no good, her Spanish is a little. The man who was driving her, he was taking her to Santa Fe, to some family there. What family? Senora Ortiz asked in Spanish, and the woman answered, pulling a folded paper from a pocket in her dress. The letter was addressed to someone named Don Alfonso Navarro in Santa Fe, and when Russell carefully unfolded it, he found text in a language he could not read. All strange letters that looped and curved in ways English never did. She needs to get to Santa Fe, Senora Ortiz said firmly. She cannot stay here alone. It is not safe for a young woman with no one to protect her. Russell knew what the older woman was implying, and part of him wanted to resist. He was a loner, a drifter who took jobs as they came and moved on when the mood struck. Taking responsibility for this strange woman would complicate everything. But when he looked at her, standing there with her dusty dress and frightened eyes, still holding onto that letter like it was the only solid thing in her world, he found himself nodding. I was heading to Santa Fe anyway, he said, which was not entirely true but could be made true easy enough. I will take her. Senora Ortiz smiled and patted his cheek like he was a child, then spoke to the woman in Spanish, gesturing to Russell. The woman looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her weighing her options, calculating risks. Finally, she nodded and spoke directly to him for the first time since they had mounted his horse, 3 words that sounded like a question. She asks your name, Senora Ortiz translated. Russell Sawyer. The woman repeated it carefully, her accent turning the R's softer, almost musical. Then she touched her own chest. Beatriz, Beatriz Navarro. Beatriz, he said, and was rewarded with the smallest hint of a smile, there and gone again like sunlight on water. Senora Ortiz insisted they stay the night. She had a small storage room that could be converted for Russell, while Beatriz would share space with the Senora's own daughters. Russell spent the evening washing the blood from his hands and clothes, then sitting on the boarding house porch and watching the sun set over the hills while he tried to make sense of his own thoughts. He should report the killing more thoroughly, should track down the sheriff, should do any number of things that did not involve riding 3 days to Santa Fe with a woman he could not even talk to. But he knew he would not. Something had happened when he heard her voice for the first time, something he could not name but also could not ignore. The next morning, they set out before dawn. Russell had bought supplies with the last of his ready cash, figuring whatever freight job had been waiting for him was gone now anyway. Beatriz wore the same dress, though Senora Ortiz had given her a shawl and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun. They rode double again, Russell's horse strong enough to carry them both at a steady pace. As the sun rose and the desert began to shimmer with heat, Beatriz started talking. At first, Russell thought she was talking to him, but he soon realized she was talking to herself, a steady stream of words in that liquid language of hers. He caught a few Spanish words mixed in, recognized the name of the dead driver, and heard his own name once or twice. She seemed to be working through something, processing the trauma and fear, and he let her talk without interrupting. The sound of her voice was oddly soothing despite his inability to understand it. When they stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat some of the tortillas Senora Ortiz had packed, Beatriz sat in the shade of a scrubby juniper tree and looked at him seriously. She pointed to herself and said something, then pointed to a rock and said something else, then pointed to the sun blazing overhead and said a third word. It took Russell a moment to realize what she was doing. "You are teaching me," he said, surprised. She did not understand his words, but she must have recognized the comprehension in his face because she nodded and smiled. Then she repeated the 3 words, pointing to herself, the rock, and the sun again. This time Russell listened carefully, trying to capture the sounds. "Beatriz," he said first, because that one he knew. She shook her head and said something else, touching her chest. The same word she had used before when looking at other things. Finally, Russell understood, not her name, the word for woman or person or I. "I," he said in English, pointing to himself. She repeated the English word, then said her language's word again. They went back and forth like this, and Russell felt something like triumph when he finally managed to pronounce it close enough that she nodded in approval. They spent the rest of their rest period like that. Beatriz pointing to things and saying words, Russell attempting to repeat them, both of them laughing when he mangled the pronunciation badly. The language he learned over the next 2 days of riding was called Portuguese, and she had come from a country called Brazil, which she said was very far to the south, across an ocean he had only seen once in his life when he was a child. Her family had sent her north for reasons she could not explain in Spanish, but Russell gathered it had something to do with marriage with the man in Santa Fe whose name she shared. A brother, perhaps, or an uncle. Each time they stopped, Beatriz taught him more words: stone, water, horse, sky. Hot, cold, hungry, tired. The words felt strange in his mouth, full of sounds English never used, but he worked at them with the same determination he brought to breaking horses or learning to shoot. By the second night, when they made camp in the shelter of some rocks, Russell could say simple things. "I am hungry. The horse needs water. We will sleep now." Beatriz seemed pleased by his progress, and he noticed she was learning English too, picking up words from him just as he learned from her. She would point to something and say the Portuguese word, then look at him expectantly until he gave her the English. By the time they reached the outskirts of Santa Fe on the 3rd day, they had built the skeleton of communication between them, enough to exchange basic information even if deeper thoughts still remained locked away. Santa Fe was bigger than Pinos Altos, older too, with adobe buildings and narrow streets that spoke of its Spanish colonial past. Russell had been here twice before, but never for long. He asked directions to the Navarro household and was directed to a large home near the plaza, the kind of place that spoke of old money and established family. When they dismounted in front of it, Russell felt suddenly aware of how he must look, trail dusty and unshaven, definitely not the sort of man who belonged at the door of a house like this. Beatriz seemed nervous too, clutching the letter in her hands. Before Russell could knock, the door opened and a middle-aged man in fine clothes stood there, his eyes going wide when he saw Beatriz. "Beatriz. Beatriz Navarro," she responded in rapid Portuguese, and the man answered in kind, his accent different from hers but the language clearly the same. They talked for several minutes while Russell stood awkwardly to the side until finally the man seemed to remember he was there. "You brought her here?" the man asked in English only slightly accented. "From where?" "From Pino's Altos. Found her at an ambush site. The driver was dead." The man's face darkened. "Dead? Tomás is dead?" "Yes, sir, I am sorry." The man spoke to Beatriz again, and she responded with tears starting to form in her eyes. She had not cried when Russell found her, had not cried during the whole journey, but now the weight of everything seemed to crash down on her at once. The man stepped forward and embraced her, speaking softly in Portuguese, and Russell felt a strange pang in his chest watching them. "I am Don Alfonso Navarro," the man said, looking over Beatriz's head at Russell. "This is my niece, come from Brazil to live with our family. We had arranged for Tomás to bring her from the port, but when she did not arrive, we feared the worst. You have done us a great service, senor." "Sawyer, Russell Sawyer, I just did what anyone would do." "No," Don Alfonso said firmly. "Not anyone. You kept her safe and brought her here when you could have left her. My family is in your debt. Please come inside. You must be tired and hungry." Russell wanted to refuse, wanted to simply ride away and let this strange chapter of his life close. But Beatriz pulled back from her uncle's embrace and looked at him with those dark eyes, and he found himself nodding. He followed them into the house, into a world of tile floors and carved wooden furniture, paintings on the walls and the smell of cooking food. A woman he assumed was Don Alfonso's wife appeared and swept Beatriz away with excited Spanish chatter, leaving Russell alone with the older man. "My niece's parents sent her here to escape some trouble in Brazil," Don Alfonso explained as he poured 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter. "Political trouble. Her father was on the wrong side of some imperial dispute, and it became unsafe for her there. We had hoped she might find a new life here, perhaps marry well and start a family in a peaceful place. But now, with Tomás dead and this ambush, I fear the trouble has followed her." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that kills men and does not care who sees." Don Alfonso handed Russell a glass. "I will of course compensate you for your time and effort in bringing her here. Name your price." Russell sipped the wine, which was better than anything he had ever tasted, and considered. He could use the money. He was down to almost nothing, and winter would come eventually, and even a drifter needed to eat. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was not a demand for payment. "Teach me Portuguese," he said. Don Alfonso blinked. "I beg your pardon." "On the ride here, your niece started teaching me her language. I would like to continue learning. If you are worried about her safety, worried about this trouble, then maybe it would be useful to have someone around who can protect her, someone she can talk to." It was a foolish offer, the kind of thing Russell would normally never say. He was not a bodyguard, was not even particularly good with a gun compared to real gunfighters. But the thought of riding away and never hearing Beatriz's voice again, never learning what all those words meant, never seeing her smile when he finally pronounced something correctly, that thought was somehow worse than staying in a place for longer than a few weeks. Don Alfonso studied him for a long moment. "You care for her already." It was not a question, but Russell answered anyway. "I care about doing what is right. She has been through something terrible. She deserves to feel safe. And you believe you can keep her safe." "I kept her safe for 3 days. I reckon I can manage a bit longer." Don Alfonso smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Very well, Senor Sawyer. You may stay in our guest quarters. In exchange for your protection and assistance with whatever matters arise, I will teach you Portuguese, and you may speak with my niece as much as is proper. Does that seem fair?" They shook hands, and Russell felt like he had just made either the best or worst decision of his life. Over the next few weeks, As summer deepened, and the afternoon rains came to Santa Fe with their brief violence, he began to suspect it was the best. Don Alfonso proved to be a patient teacher, drilling Russell in grammar and vocabulary every morning while Beatriz recovered from her ordeal under the watchful care of her aunt. Russell learned the verbs, the conjugations, the strange nasal sounds that Portuguese required. He practiced by talking to the servants, most of whom spoke Spanish but understood Portuguese well enough, and by reading simple texts Don Alfonso provided. When Beatriz finally emerged from her convalescence, she seemed surprised and delighted to find Russell still there. They began taking walks in the garden, ostensibly so Russell could practice his Portuguese, but really because they both wanted to. He learned that she was 20 years old, had 3 younger sisters back in Brazil, loved music and books and the ocean. She learned that he was an orphan who had grown up on a ranch in Texas, had been drifting since he was 16, had never stayed in one place longer than a few months. Why not? She asked one evening as they sat beneath an apricot tree, her Portuguese slow and clear so he could understand. Why do you always move? Russell struggled for the words in her language, fell back on English, then tried again. I do not know. I thought I was looking for something, but I never found it. And now? He looked at her, at the way the sunset turned her skin golden, at the intelligence and humor in her eyes. Maybe I stopped looking. She smiled and said something he did not quite catch, and when he asked her to repeat it, she shook her head. Later, when your Portuguese is better. As summer turned toward fall, Russell's Portuguese did get better. He could hold real conversations now, could express complex thoughts even if he sometimes had to search for the right word. Beatriz's English improved too, and they often mixed the 2 languages together, laughing at the confusion they created. The household staff grew used to seeing them together, and Russell was careful to always maintain propriety, but anyone with eyes could see what was growing between them. Don Alfonso certainly saw it. One evening in late September, he called Russell into his study and poured them both whiskey. My niece has become quite fond of you, he said without preamble. Russell met his eyes steadily. I am fond of her too. You understand that her parents sent her here with certain expectations. She comes from a good family, a family with status and connections. They hoped she might marry well here, marry into another good family. I understand that I am not what they had in mind, Russell said. I am a cowboy with no family, no money, no prospects beyond whatever job I can find next, but I can make her happy. I know I can. Happiness is not everything in a marriage. No, sir, but it is something. And from what I understand, whatever marriage her parents had planned for her in Brazil was not going to make her happy at all. Don Alfonso sighed and leaned back in his chair. You are right about that. They were going to marry her to a man 3 times her age, a man with connections to the imperial court. She would have been miserable. He was quiet for a moment, then continued. I want to offer you a position, Senor Sawyer, a permanent position. I have business interests that require management, freight contracts, some ranch land, investments in the silver mines. I need someone I can trust, someone honest and capable, someone who cares about more than just profit. Russell stared at him. You are offering me a job. I am offering you a life, a chance to stay in one place to build something, and if in the course of that life you and my niece should decide you suit each other well, I would not stand in your way. It was more than Russell had ever imagined having, stability, purpose, a reason to stay. And Beatriz, if she would have him. The old him, the drifter, would have refused on principle, would have felt trapped by the offer. But he was not that person anymore, or maybe he had never been that person at all and just had not realized it until a woman started speaking words he had never heard before. "I accept," Russell said, "and I promise you will not regret it." Don Alfonso smiled and raised his glass. "To new beginnings, then." Russell told Beatriz that night in the garden, switching between English and Portuguese as he tried to explain what her uncle had offered, what he had accepted, what he hoped it might mean for them. She listened in silence until he ran out of words, and then she took his hands in hers. "You will stay?" she asked in Portuguese, her voice soft. "You will not leave?" "I will stay," he promised, "for as long as you want me here." "Then you will stay forever," she said, and kissed him. It was the first time they had kissed, and Russell felt like every moment of his life had been leading to this, to the taste of her lips and the feel of her hair slipping through his fingers, and the knowledge that he had finally found what he had been looking for all along, even if he had not known he was looking. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Beatriz laughed and spoke in Portuguese. "What did you say?" Russell asked, even though his Portuguese was good enough now that he had mostly understood. "I said that I have been waiting for you to kiss me for 2 months. I was starting to think you never would. I was trying to be respectful. Your uncle would have shot me. My uncle knew this would happen from the first day. He is not blind." She kissed him again, softer this time. "Do you remember the first time we spoke? When you could not understand anything I said, I remember. I said, 'Who are you? Are you an angel or a devil?' Because you appeared like something from a dream, but there was blood on your hands. What do you think now? Angel or devil?" She pretended to consider. "Neither. You are just a man, a good man. My man, if you will have me." "I will have you," Russell said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They told Don Alfonso the next morning, and while he pretended to be surprised, Russell could see the satisfaction in the older man's eyes. A formal courtship began, with all the rules and proprieties that came with it, but everyone knew it was just a matter of time. Russell threw himself into his new work, learning the business side of Don Alfonso's various ventures, riding out to check on the freight wagons and cattle, meeting with the investors and partners. He had a head for numbers he had never known about, and a way with people that served him well in negotiations. Within months, he had not only justified Don Alfonso's faith in him, but had increased the profitability of several ventures. But the work, important as it was, mattered less than the time he spent with Beatriz. They talked for hours, in Portuguese and English both, teaching each other not just words but worlds. She taught him about Brazil, about the coffee plantations and the tropical forests, about carnival and saudade and the particular blue of the South Atlantic. He taught her about the American West, about the cattle drives and the boom towns, about honor and loneliness and the particular orange of a desert sunset. They read poetry together, she in Portuguese and he in English, each learning to hear the music in the other's language. On Christmas Eve 1878, Russell asked Beatriz to marry him. They were in the garden again, bundled against the winter cold, and he did it in Portuguese because he wanted her to hear it in the language of her heart. She said yes before he even finished the question, laughing and crying at the same time, and they stood there in the moonlight, holding each other while snow began to fall on Santa Fe. The wedding took place in March of 1879, in the cathedral on the plaza, with half of Santa Fe in attendance. Russell had never imagined having a wedding like this, all ceremony and celebration, but Beatriz deserved it and more. She wore a white dress her aunt had made, and when she walked down the aisle toward him, Russell felt his throat tighten with emotion. They said their vows in both English and Portuguese, promising to love and honor each other for all the days of their lives. The priest pronounced them married, and when Russell kissed his wife, he tasted salt from both their tears. Don Alfonso gave them a house as a wedding gift, a small adobe near the plaza with a garden and enough rooms for a growing family. Russell had never owned property before, had never even imagined it, but now he stood in the doorway with Beatriz in his arms, carrying her over the threshold into their new life, and it felt as natural as breathing. Their first year of marriage was everything Russell had never known he wanted. He went to work each morning managing Don Alfonso's businesses, came home each evening to a wife who greeted him with a smile and a kiss. They cooked together, Beatriz teaching him Brazilian recipes while he showed her how to make the simple trail food he had grown up on. They made love in the afternoon when the sun slanted through the bedroom windows, and late at night when the house was dark and quiet. They talked until dawn sometimes, still finding new things to say, new stories to share. Beatriz became pregnant in the summer, and Russell discovered a new kind of fear alongside his joy. He had seen women die in childbirth, knew how dangerous it could be, and the thought of losing her paralyzed him sometimes. But Beatriz was strong and healthy, and her aunt was experienced with such things. And when their son was born in March of 1880, 1 year almost to the day after their wedding, both mother and child survived. They named him Raphael, and Russell held his son for the first time with hands that shook. The baby was tiny and red, squalling with impressive lungs, and Russell had never seen anything so perfect in his life. Beatriz, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at him from the bed. "What do you think?" she asked in Portuguese. "Is he handsome like his father?" "He is handsome like his mother," Russell said, and meant it. Raphael became the center of their world, and Russell discovered that fatherhood suited him. He learned to change diapers and warm bottles, to walk the floor at night when the baby could not sleep, to make funny faces that earned him gummy smiles. Beatriz nursed Raphael while Russell read to them both, sometimes in English and sometimes in Portuguese, wanting their son to grow up with both languages, both worlds. As Raphael grew from infant to toddler, Russell's business ventures continued to prosper. He had a knack for it that surprised everyone, including himself. Don Alfonso began talking about retirement, about handing over more control to Russell. It was a responsibility Russell took seriously, knowing that he was not just building a life for himself, but for his family, for the children he and Beatriz hoped to have. Their daughter came in 1882, born during a thunderstorm that shook the house. They named her Maria, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Raphael, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything even when his help made things harder. Russell watched his children play together and felt a contentment he had never known was possible. But life was not without its challenges. In the spring of 1883, word reached Santa Fe that someone was asking questions about Beatriz, about where she had come from and who she was. The old trouble from Brazil, it seemed, had not forgotten about her. Don Alfonso took the threat seriously, hiring additional guards and warning Russell to be careful. For a few tense weeks, Russell barely slept, always listening for sounds of danger, always watching the shadows. But whoever had been asking questions never showed themselves, and eventually the threat seemed to fade. "You ever regret it?" Russell asked Beatriz one night after they had finally allowed themselves to relax. "Coming here, leaving Brazil, everything that happened." She was quiet for a moment, nursing Maria while Raphael slept in the next room. "I regret that Tomás died. I regret that my parents and sisters are so far away, but regret coming here, regret finding you," she shook her head. "Never, not for a single moment." In 1884, Don Alfonso did retire, signing over control of his businesses to Russell with a ceremony that felt almost sacred. Russell was 30 years old, married with 2 children, a respected businessman in Santa Fe. If someone had told him this would be his life when he was 24 and drifting from job to job, he would never have believed them. But here he was, and here he would stay. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas after the driver who had died bringing Beatriz north, was born in 1885. By then, Russell's Portuguese was as fluent as his English, and he often found himself thinking in both languages, his mind translating unconsciously. The children were growing up trilingual, speaking English and Portuguese and Spanish with equal ease, and Russell loved listening to them chatter, switching between languages mid-sentence like it was the most natural thing in the world. As the years passed, Russell and Beatriz grew older together, their love deepening in ways he had not known love could deepen. The passion of their early days remained, but it was joined by something else now, something quieter but no less powerful. They knew each other completely, knew each other's fears and dreams and secret shames. They had weathered storms together, had buried loved ones and celebrated births, had fought and made up and learned how to be partners in every sense of the word. Raphael grew into a serious boy who loved books, Maria was wild and fearless, and Thomas was gentle and thoughtful. Russell taught them to ride, took them out to the ranch lands to see the cattle and horses. Beatriz taught them music and poetry, filled the house with art and beauty. Together, they gave their children everything Russell had never had growing up: stability, love, a home that would always be waiting. In 1890, when Russell was 36 and Beatriz 32, they took a trip back to Brazil. It was something Beatriz had been dreaming about for years, a chance to see her parents and sisters again, to show them the life she had built and the family she had created. The journey took weeks, first by train and then by ship, and Russell saw for the first time the ocean as Beatriz had known it, vast and blue and terrifying. Brazil was everything she had described and more, hot and green and alive in a way New Mexico could never be. Beatriz's family welcomed them with tears and laughter, and Russell did his best to keep up with the rapid-fire Portuguese that flew around the dinner table. He met the sisters Beatriz had told him about, saw the plantation where she had grown up, understood finally what she had left behind when she came north. "You wish you could stay?" he asked one night as they lay in the bed of her childhood room, listening to unfamiliar sounds outside the window. "I love it here," Beatriz said honestly. "I missed it more than I realized, but my home is with you now. My home is where our children are. We will visit again, but we will go back to Santa Fe." And they did, carrying gifts and stories, their children's heads full of new words and experiences. The house felt smaller after the spacious plantation, but it felt like theirs in a way that nothing else ever could. More years passed, marked by birthdays and holidays, by business successes and small failures, by the ordinary, extraordinary events of a life lived fully. Russell's hair started to gray at the temples, and Beatriz found her first white hair and mourned it dramatically until Russell told her she was more beautiful than ever, and he meant it. Their children grew, Raphael showing an interest in his father's business, Maria wanting to be a teacher, Thomas talking about becoming a doctor. In 1895, Raphael brought home a girl he wanted to marry, and Russell saw in his son's eyes the same look he must have had when he first realized he loved Beatriz. The wedding was a joyous affair, and Russell and Beatriz became grandparents the following year, a grandson named James who had Russell's nose and Beatriz's eyes. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over Santa Fe, Beatriz leaned her head on Russell's shoulder and spoke in Portuguese, the language they still used when they wanted to say things that felt too intimate for English. You remember the first time you heard me speak, when you could not understand anything I said. I remember, Russell said, his own Portuguese still accented after all these years but fluent and easy. I thought you sounded like music. I was so frightened. And then you appeared, this cowboy with blood on his hands and gentleness in his eyes, and I did not know what to think. And now, she smiled, now I know you saved my life, not just that day but every day since. You gave me a home when I had none. You learned my language when you could have just asked me to learn yours. You loved me when I was strange and foreign and complicated. You were never strange to me, Russell said. Different, yes, but never strange. From the first moment, you felt like something I had been missing my whole life without knowing it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned orange and purple and finally dark. Russell thought about the young man he had been, drifting and alone, thinking he preferred it that way. He thought about that day in the desert, kneeling beside a dead man and hearing a voice speaking words he had never heard before. He thought about the choice he had made to stay, to learn, to open himself up to something new. I am glad I learned your language, he said finally. I am glad you taught me. I am glad you wanted to learn, Beatriz replied. Not every man would have tried. More years passed, and they grew old together, their children having children of their own, their house always full of family and laughter and the sound of multiple languages mixing together. Russell's business sense ensured their financial security, and Beatriz's warmth ensured they were never without friends or family nearby. They became the center of their growing clan, the patriarch and matriarch who had started it all. In 1905, on their 26th wedding anniversary, Russell and Beatriz renewed their vows in the same cathedral where they had married. Their children and grandchildren filled the pews, and when Russell spoke his vows in Portuguese, his voice cracking with emotion, there was not a dry eye in the church. They were both 51 now, Beatriz's hair more silver than black and Russell's face lined with decades of sun and wind and laughter. But when they kissed, it was with the same passion and tenderness they had shared in the garden all those years ago. That night, lying in bed in the house they had shared for so long, Beatriz spoke softly in Portuguese. What was that you said? Russell asked. Even though he had heard her perfectly, she smiled, knowing his game. I said I love you, I will always love you, in this life and whatever comes after. In this life and whatever comes after, Russell repeated and kissed her forehead. I love you too, in any language, in every language, forever. They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, and Russell dreamed of a desert day long ago when he had heard words he could not understand and had decided to learn them. It was the best decision he had ever made, and he had never regretted it, not for a single moment of all the years that followed. The children asked sometimes how they had fallen in love when they could barely speak to each other at first. Russell always said it was because Beatriz had taught him her language, word by word, and in doing so had taught him how to love. Beatriz always said it was because Russell had been willing to learn, had been willing to try, had been willing to meet her halfway even when halfway was a foreign country. They were both right. As they moved into their 60s and 70s, Russell and Beatriz slowed down but never stopped. They still took walks in the garden, still read poetry to each other in 2 languages, still argued about which version of a story was correct and which was embellished by time and memory. Their grandchildren brought their own children to visit, and the house rang with young voices speaking English and Portuguese and Spanish, all mixed together in a beautiful chaos that made Russell's heart full. Maria became a beloved teacher in Santa Fe. Thomas did become a doctor and served the community with dedication. and Raphael took over the family business with the same acumen his father had shown. They all married, had children, built lives that honored the example Russell and Beatriz had set for them. The family tree grew and branched, reaching into the future while staying rooted in the love story that had started it all. In 1912, Russell was 58 and Beatriz 54 when Don Alfonso passed away peacefully in his sleep. Russell had lost his mentor, his friend, the man who had given him a chance when he was just a drifter with nothing to his name. At the funeral, Russell spoke about what Don Alfonso had meant to him, how one act of generosity had changed the course of his entire life. Beatriz held his hand throughout the service, and Russell drew strength from her presence as he always had. The world was changing around them. New Mexico achieved statehood that year, and Russell marveled that he had lived to see the territory become a state. Cars were starting to appear on the streets of Santa Fe, and people talked about airplanes and electricity and all manner of modern wonders. But through all the changes, Russell and Beatriz remained constant, their love the one unchanging thing in a world of transformation. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1919, surrounded by a family that now included over 30 people if you counted all the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The party lasted all day, with food and music and stories told in multiple languages. Russell, now 65, stood up to make a toast and found himself looking around at all the faces, all the lives that existed because he had found a woman speaking words he had never heard before, and had decided to learn what those words meant. 40 years ago, he said, speaking in Portuguese so Beatriz would understand every word, I met a woman who changed everything. I was alone. I was drifting. I did not know what I was looking for, but I knew I had not found it. And then I heard her voice, speaking a language I had never heard, and something in me recognized that this was what I had been searching for all along. Not the language, but the person behind it. Not the words, but the soul speaking them. He switched to English so everyone could understand. Beatriz taught me her language word by word, patiently and with love. She taught me how to say water and sky and hungry and tired. But more than that, she taught me how to say home and family and forever. She taught me that love is not about understanding everything right away. It is about being willing to learn. It is about putting in the work to bridge the distance between two people. It is about meeting each other halfway and then going the rest of the way together. Tears ran down his face, and he did not bother to wipe them away. I have had the great privilege of spending 40 years learning from this woman, learning with this woman, building a life with this woman. And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Beatriz, you are my heart. You are my home. You are every word I ever needed to know. Beatriz was crying too, and when Russell sat down beside her, she took his face in her hands and kissed him in front of everyone. And the room erupted in applause and laughter and more than a few tears. They danced that night, slowly and carefully, because they were not young anymore, but with all the love they had carried for 4 decades. The band played songs from Brazil and songs from America, and Russell hummed along to both, his life now a perfect blend of her world and his world, no longer 2 separate things but one beautiful whole. The years continued their march, and Russell and Beatriz grew older still. They moved a bit slower, forgot things more often, needed help with tasks that used to be easy. But they still had each other, still shared the bed they had shared for decades, still said, I love you every morning and every night in both languages, never taking for granted the gift they had been given. In 1924, when Russell was 70 and Beatriz 66, they received word that her youngest sister had passed away in Brazil. Beatriz grieved deeply for the loss, for the sister she had not seen in years, for the family ties that distance had attenuated but never broken. Russell held her while she cried, spoke softly to her in Portuguese, reminded her of all the good times and happy memories. He knew grief, had lost his own share of loved ones, and he knew the only cure was time and love and the presence of someone who understood. They took one more trip to Brazil that year, so Beatriz could pay her respects and see her nieces and nephews. Russell was older now, the journey harder, but he would have gone to the ends of the earth for her, and they both knew it. They spent a month in Brazil, and Russell saw how bittersweet it was for Beatriz, this place that had been her first home but could never be her home again. Too much time had passed, too much had changed, and her real home was with him, back in Santa Fe, with their children and grandchildren and the life they had built together. When they returned to New Mexico, Beatriz kissed the ground outside their house and declared she would never leave again. Russell laughed and kissed her and carried her over the threshold one more time, just like he had 45 years before, though it took more effort now and made his back ache for days after. Their 50th anniversary in 1929 was a quieter affair than their 40th had been. The country was reeling from the stock market crash, and many were worried about the future. But Russell and Beatriz had weathered storms before and would weather this one too. They celebrated with just their immediate family, 3 generations gathered in the house that had held so much life and love. Raphael gave a speech thanking his parents for the example they had set, for showing him and his siblings what a real marriage looked like. Maria played the piano, a piece by a Brazilian composer that made Beatriz weep with nostalgia and joy. Thomas read a poem he had written, comparing his parents' love to the steadfast mountains and the enduring desert. And Russell and Beatriz simply held hands and smiled, content in the knowledge that they had done well, had built something that would last beyond their own lives, had loved each other truly and completely for 50 years. As they moved into their 80s, their health began to fail in small ways. Russell's heart was not as strong as it once was, and Beatriz's joints ached in the cold. They spent more time sitting on the porch, less time walking in the garden. But they were still together, still talking and laughing and occasionally arguing about something that did not matter at all, except that it gave them an excuse to talk. They still spoke in both languages, Russell's Portuguese as fluent now as his English, Beatriz's English perfected over decades of practice. On a warm spring evening in 1932, sitting on that same porch where they had spent so many evenings before, Russell looked at his wife and felt a swell of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. They were old now, both of them, their bodies failing even as their minds remained sharp. But they had made it. They had built something beautiful out of that chance meeting in the desert all those years ago. They had loved each other well and true, and their love had created ripples that would spread through generations to come. "What are you thinking about?" Beatriz asked in Portuguese, the language she still preferred for intimate conversations. "I am thinking about the first time I heard you speak," Russell said, also in Portuguese. "I am thinking about how I did not understand a single word, but I knew I wanted to learn. I knew you were important, even before I knew your name." "I was thinking the same thing," Beatriz said softly. "I was remembering how frightened I was, how alone I felt, and then you were there, and even though we could not talk to each other, I felt safe. I felt like maybe everything would be all right." "Was I right?" Russell asked. "Is everything all right?" Beatriz smiled, the same smile that had captured his heart 54 years before. "Everything is perfect. Everything has always been perfect, from the moment you decided to stay to learn to love me." "That was the easiest decision I ever made," Russell said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over Santa Fe, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. Somewhere in the house, their great-grandchildren were playing, their laughter drifting through the open windows. The smell of dinner cooking filled the air, a Brazilian dish that Beatriz had taught their daughter-in-law to make. Music played on the radio, a new invention that still amazed them both. Russell reached for Beatriz's hand, and she gave it to him without hesitation, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. Two people who had started out unable to understand each other, who had bridged that gap word by word, who had built a life and a family and a love story that would be told for generations. "I love you," Russell said in Portuguese, "now and always." "I love you," Beatriz replied in English. "Forever and beyond." They sat together until the stars came out, and then their grandson came to help them inside, careful and respectful, and Russell thought about how lucky he was. Lucky to have found her, lucky to have learned her language, lucky to have been loved by her. Lucky to have built this life. As they settled into bed that night, Russell pulled Beatriz close and listened to her breathing, the same sound he had been listening to for decades. Tomorrow they would wake up and do it all again, talking and laughing and living, surrounded by the family their love had created. And the day after that, and the day after that, for as many days as they were given. "Thank you," Russell whispered in Portuguese, not sure if she was still awake. "For what?" Beatriz murmured. "For teaching me, for being patient, for loving me." "Thank you for wanting to learn," she whispered back. "Not every man would have tried." They fell asleep that way, as they had 1,000 times before. Two souls who had found each other across languages and cultures and all the barriers that should have kept them apart, but never did. And in the morning, they would wake up together, as they had every morning for over 50 years, and they would say good morning in Portuguese and English both, and they would start another day of the beautiful life they had built together, word by word, day by day with love.